Hello, and welcome to Looking to Score, the podcast where we geek out about movie scores, their composers, and everything else in between. I'm Brianne Brennan, and joining me as always is the man who sold his skin, Brett Blake. How are you?
My goodness. Skinless, but otherwise fine.
I mean, I was just figured you'd be advertising
It could
on
be.
your skin. All right. Now, before we get into the fun stuff, we want to bring you our pre-show picks, where we tell you what we've been listening to recently. Brett, what do you have? What have you been listening to?
So my pick this week is 2015's Steve Jobs score by Daniel Pemberton. I revisited the movie fairly recently, and while watching it, I was struck again by how quirky and eclectic this score is. I mean, it's got everything from synthy electronics to opera, and it really functions very well in the movie, and it's a very satisfying listen in album form. So people should definitely check that out. And just by the way, 2015, looking back at it, was a pretty incredible year for movie scores. So just throwing that out there.
Absolutely. Now, I've been listening to Debbie Wiseman live at the Barbican, and she's kind of kind of off the radar composer a little bit. And this album is a really good listen. It's an eclectic mix of TV and film work, and the live orchestra really makes for a good listen. So if you're looking for a lady composer to check out, definitely check out Debbie Wiseman. All right, today we are focusing on Michael Giacchino and how to use your influences. What does that mean?
That's a good question. I think Giacchino sometimes gets a bad rap in the film score community for too often aping other composers' scores or styles, but I don't intend for that to be a negative. But I think that basic subject is interesting to discuss because you can point to various elements of various scores of his and draw a direct line to other works, either just by general influence or by explicit Giacchino quoting something from another work. So I think it's an interesting subject, and I don't mean to present any of this, and I know you don't either, as a slight or a negative against Giacchino, because I think he's actually very good at this, and he's very open about it. It's not like he's trying to pull one over on anybody. When he's influenced by somebody or he's using somebody else's material, he's happy to tell you, and he's happy to explain why. So I think it's just interesting to dive into as a subset of his work.
Yeah, so kind of going off that, I think we can start with how he got his start. And I think a lot of that kind of homage to other composers kind of starts with when he grew up. So I'm going to quote from an interview from Medium.com where he spoke of his growing up and kind of discovering his love for film soundtracks. He says, "I love just the way that they could fill your mind with a story or take you back to whatever film that was a part of. Because as a kid, you couldn't watch it on TV again. If it was out of the theater, it was gone. So the only way to relive that movie was by listening to its score. And back then, from years prior, film scores were so great at just bringing you right back to either a theme or a melody that is associated with that particular film or character." So, I mean, you kind of see early on that, you know, his love for film absolutely carried over into what he does now.
Definitely. And he talks about, growing up at a time where you had the major titans who were really at the top of their game. You had your John Williamses, your Jerry Goldsmiths, your John Barrys. They were all, the big kings of film scoring when he was growing up and becoming a fan. So obviously they're going to have some degree of influence over his style as a composer.
Yeah, and he pretty much got his start with video game composing. I believe he had an internship with Universal and ended up getting hired out of that and started composing for like when early consoles like PlayStation and I think Sega Saturn kind of started adding scoring to their games. And you'll talk about this. There's a video game of the Lost World that he scored,
Yeah.
as well as a couple others. So,
Yeah, he was hired, and I don't know. I've heard different versions of this story. Some say he was sort of handpicked by Spielberg, which I don't really know why Spielberg would have known who he was, but it makes for an interesting story. So let's go with it.
sure.
When the legend becomes fact, print the legend, to quote a famous Western. So he gets picked to score the video game for the Lost World Jurassic Park. And if this wasn't his first professional job, it was certainly his first high profile professional job. And if you listen to this Lost World score, in general, I would say it sounds more inspired by John Williams' Indiana Jones scores than by either Jurassic Park or The Lost World. But
Mhm.
he's clearly evoking John Williams, as you'll hear in this cue called Primordial Forest. And this sort of seemed to set Giacchino on a path of eventually being considered, often kind of derisively, as the new John Williams,
Mhm.
especially as he grows as a film composer. But as I said at the top of this discussion, I don't think that's particularly fair or accurate. They're similar to me in the sense that they both approach scoring in the same way, which he alluded to in that quote you read. Theme. Everything revolves around theme heavy composition. And there just aren't a ton of composers working today, or let's say the early 2000s, who are coming up in the early 2000s, who still approached film scoring in that style. So I think that's the primary connection between Giacchino and Williams to me.
Now, going off what you said about theme and having the rest of the score revolve around it, I think that statement kind of goes hand in hand with what John Barry has spoken about in the past. And we quoted this on our John Barry episode, but he says, like, where if you lock in a certain character or emotion, the score will be more melodic and memorable. So I think you hear that in Giacchino's work on The Incredibles, which was inspired by Barry and his Bond scores.
Yeah, now this is interesting because there's a very strong connection between this score and this film and Barry's work, and not just because Giacchino and Brad Bird, the director, made a conscious choice to evoke him, but because Barry was actually initially approached to score this movie.
Mhm.
And the story is basically that Bird and Barry talked. Barry was intrigued and he went off to work on some demo material. When he played Bird the stuff that he'd come up with, what I've heard it described as being very melancholy, very much in
Hmm.
his 1990s, early 2000s sound. Barry apparently was really taken with the midlife crisis aspect of the movie, and his ideas were more catered to emphasizing that than the sort of period retro inspired setting or the superhero action. So Bird, obviously, given the design aesthetic of the movie, was hoping for some throwback type stuff that would call to mind Barry's classic James Bond scores of the 60s. And Barry's reply to that basically was, well, I've already done that. I did it 40 years ago, and I've sort of progressed beyond that style. And so they parted ways, and Giacchino was then brought on board. Interestingly, the Barry influence on the film can be heard in the very first teaser trailer for the movie, which came out, I think, a full year before release. That teaser directly uses Barry's On Her Majesty's Secret Service theme. And that theme would be used by Giacchino as sort of a jumping off point for his own Incredibles theme. So, what you're going to hear first here is the main theme from On Her Majesty's Secret Service by John Barry. And then you're also going to hear sort of the main fanfare melody that Giacchino created for The Incredibles.
I think we need to have a drinking game every time you slip On Her Majesty's Secret Service into one of our episodes.
I'm secretly being paid by the OHMSS fan club to mention it as often as I possibly can. And I'm happy to admit that, and I'm happy to take their money. It's a great score. What can I say? I love that score. Going a little bit beyond On Her Majesty's Secret Service, though, there are plenty of Easter egg style Barry influences throughout the score. And one of my favorites is this riff on what's called the Capsule in Space March from Barry's You Only Live Twice that Giacchino implements. So here is Capsule in Space from You Only Live Twice. And here is Kronos Unveiled from The Incredibles.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy how similar they sound.
Yeah, and he's again, he's open about all this. He's like, yeah, this scene was temp tracked with this cue from You Only Live Twice,
Mm.
and it's not, again, he's not trying to pull a fast one. It's like, so I riffed on it. It's like I did my own kind of spin on this piece, and it works really well in the movie. And these Barry influences, which I feel are more in the first Incredibles score than there are in the second Incredibles score, it gives that film such a unique kind of flavor in the Pixar pantheon to me. It's one of my favorite scores of his.
Absolutely. All right, moving on. We have another connection, a love letter to Bernard Herrmann with his Lost scores.
Yeah, now the Lost scores, they're almost too vast to really just touch on.
Mm-hmm.
That might be like a spotlight episode at some point we could do maybe on the Lost scores. There's a lot of Bernard Herrmann influence that you can hear, not in a one-to-one, I'm ripping something off sense, but more an attempt to evoke the feeling of Herrmann's suspense string writing, like from scores like Psycho, in the suspense cues that Giacchino wrote for Lost. So, for instance, here's a very famous cue from Psycho. It's called the temptation motif. And here's a cue from Lost that the title of the cue is itself a Psycho pun. It's called Kate's Motel.
Ha. No one was killed in the shower while writing these cues.
As far as we're aware.
All right, jumping ahead, we've got forgotten Star Wars motifs of John Williams and Rogue One, which he composed for.
Yeah, now this is interesting because these couple of motifs that I'm going to talk about, John Williams has seemingly kind of forgotten that they exist. One of them is from the original Star Wars score, 1977. And in the score, it is the theme that Williams uses for the Empire in general and Darth Vader specifically. And obviously, by the time you get to The Empire Strikes Back, he composes the Imperial March, and that sort of takes over as the theme for Vader and the Empire. But this original theme is fairly obscure. Like, not a lot of people, even John Williams fans, would be necessarily aware of this motif. But Michael Giacchino remembers, and he implements it in Rogue One. So here you're going to hear the original Empire Darth Vader theme from Star Wars. And here it is again, used by Michael Giacchino in Rogue One. Now, the next motif, in a similar vein, the Death Star in the original Star Wars had its own motif, never to be heard again, even when there was a second Death Star in Return of the Jedi. He abandoned this motif, and Giacchino dug it back out of the archives and used it in Rogue One. So here it is in Star Wars. And here it is in Rogue One.
How apropos.
I mean, it makes perfect sense. But I point these out because obviously these are a one-to-one. He's directly bringing back in a theme from another composer. But to me, this just sort of illustrates that Giacchino himself is a fan. Like, there's no way the director of Rogue One was like, "Hey, you remember that really obscure motif for Darth Vader from the original Star Wars movie? Can we use that here?" It's like this is just purely Giacchino being a fan of this score, knowing what that theme was, knowing that it's appropriate now to use it in Rogue One. And I just appreciate that he himself is such a fan of this stuff. And bonus, he kind of did it again, although this is a little more of an interpretation of a theme rather than a direct lift. So Williams in the prequels wrote the love theme Across the Stars, and Giacchino sort of transforms it into a theme for the Wills in Rogue One. So here it is in Attack of the Clones. And here is Giacchino's transformation of it in Rogue One.
All right. Up next, we have what was actually just mentioned in Entertainment Weekly's must list was the score to The Batman.
Really?
Yeah.
What's a good score? It's the early leader in the clubhouse for the best score of this year. And this is a really interesting case because this isn't too spoilery, I don't think. But in the movie, the main villain is the Riddler. And the Riddler, as a character, has a connection to the song Ave Maria, which is made explicit in the movie a couple of times. So if you listen to the central melody of Ave Maria and then listen to Giacchino's theme for the Riddler, you can tell that he thought that this was an important connection to make musically. The exact notes are not the same, but the progression of the melody, the rhythm of the melody, is essentially the same. So here's Ave Maria. And here is the Riddler's theme.
Next up, we have some more John Williams love with Jurassic World.
Yes. Now, this is a case where the score, obviously, sort of like Rogue One, you do have direct quotations of John Williams' Jurassic Park material, and you want that in a sequel score in this franchise.
Of course.
But what's more interesting is the way that Giacchino integrates a component of Williams' music and sort of integrates it into his own theme. So there's an overlapping phrase between John Williams's main Jurassic Park theme and Giacchino's main Jurassic World theme. A phrase at the beginning of Williams's melody is incorporated at the end of Giacchino's melody. So here is this little bit from Jurassic Park. And here is that same phrase used differently in the Jurassic World theme.
And there you go. And like I said before, I think all of these they're not ripoffs. They're love letters from a fan.
Exactly.
So we're just going to jump into highlighting some of our favorite pieces. We've got 3 each. So why don't you give us your first pick here?
Sure. So I think the motivation behind what I picked here, although it wasn't really conscious as I was doing it, was, now that we've talked about how he incorporates his influences and maybe even existing material, I thought I sort of would want to highlight some themes that I think are more distinctly Giacchino. That doesn't mean they're not influenced in some way by other composers, but these picks are a few that just feel more directly like they're examples of Giacchino's personal voice as a composer, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to start with a pick again from Lost, and to me, Lost is really Giacchino's magnum opus. I mean, I can't think of another television show that utilized and developed as many themes and motifs as Giacchino poured into the scores for this series. I mean, there have to be easily probably 20 distinct melodic ideas that he explores at length. And what you're going to hear in this cue is one of my favorite themes of the entire show. It's for a character named Juliet, and it's a cue called Oceans Apart.
All right, for my first pick, I'm going to highlight Super 8 and the cue Super 8 Suite. And, for a movie that oozes with Spielbergian tropes, I think Giacchino really creates a score here that's pretty much a tip of the hat to Spielberg's go-to composer, John Williams.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the cue, you can really hear the main theme swell in this grand fashion, along with a distinct French horn counter melody in the background, an instrument that John Williams frequently highlights.
Super 8 is a great score. Definitely anybody listening should check that out. And I would add, I think it's an unfairly maligned film overall, even though it does have some problems. But anyway, uh, my next pick is from Tomorrowland. And Giacchino's Tomorrowland score overall is very good, but this cue, which is called Pin Ultimate Experience, is really the highlight of the entire thing for me. And the theme that you're going to hear balances equal parts wonder, mystery, and excitement in the same way that a lot of the great fantasy adventure themes of the 1980s do. So this is Pin Ultimate Experience.
A score arguably better than the movie itself? Question mark.
Yeah, there's no argument. I mean, even though I'm a defender of that movie up to a point,
Yeah, it's okay.
it kind of goes off the rails in the final act. But yeah, the score overall is better than the movie overall.
All right, my next pick is from Up, and this is Giacchino's first Oscar win and also the first Pixar film to win a score Oscar. The cue I'm going to highlight here is called the Ellie Badge. And I'm going to quote from an editorial on filmtracks.com that pretty much sums up the impact of the theme better than I could say. So they say the most important of these themes in the film is Ellie's, for not only does her personality drive the relationship in its early scenes, but her loss is so devastating to Carl that he is largely devoid of his own clear musical identity. So that's kind of interesting. There are a lot of, upbeat kind of quirky themes in Up, but this particular cue, I think, just sums up the emotion of the main character so much in such a simplistic fashion that it's actually pretty masterful. So here is the Ellie Badge.
I think it's pretty safe to say that this theme, if not exactly this cue, is what won this score the Oscar because people came away from the movie with this theme in their heads, and it's very effective within the body of the movie itself.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so my last pick is kind of a 2-for-1 because there are two themes in this section of cue that you're going to hear. It's from Inside Out, and it's the cue called Joy Turns to Sadness / A Growing Personality. And I put a lot of thought into whether I was actually going to say what I'm about to say, and I'm going to say it. I think these are two of the best themes that he's ever written, and I think they're so emotionally incisive, but in two very different ways. And they work together in this cue here at sort of the cathartic moment of the entire movie. And it's pretty fantastic, moving stuff.
All right, for my final pick, we've got his other Pixar movie, Ratatouille, and the cue is Ratatouille main theme. There's just something so enjoyable about this score. Maybe it's the upbeat, catchy rhythms or the sweet main theme that creates a magical atmosphere. But even though we hear a lot of, cliche French instrumentation here, it really has so much heart.
One of the things I love about the Ratatouille score is the way that Giacchino probably had a list of like every stereotypical cliched French music idea and said, I'm going to use all of these, but I'm going to somehow find a way to make it not annoying, not aggravating, and keep it fresh.
Yeah.
and it's just an extremely entertaining score to listen to.
And there you have it. The next John Williams, Michael Giacchino.
Or is he?
I don't know.
He could just be
We'll
the
see.
next Michael Giacchino.
There you go. However you feel about it, go listen to some Michael Giacchino scores. You'll be pleased that you did.
It's well worth the investment.
Thank you again for joining us, everybody. Be sure to check out our companion playlists for the show on Spotify, which contain a majority of the music we touch on in each episode. Just search for Looking to Score playlists and give us a follow. Until next week.
Bye.